One rainy morning, a millionaire CEO stopped to help a little girl with a red umbrella. He never imagined her quiet words would shatter his heart and change his life forever. Edward Harrison had never been the sort of man who noticed the weather. For most of his life, he had moved from one glass-fronted building to another, shielded by tinted windows and private drivers, the temperature outside reduced to nothing more than a number on a screen he rarely glanced at. But that morning, when he decided to walk the last few blocks to his office, the sky opened with such sudden violence that it felt like the rain was determined to remind him he was still human, still vulnerable to something as simple as a storm. The first cold drops hit the back of his neck as he passed a boarded-up bookstore, seeping through the collar of his tailored coat. He ignored them at first, lengthening his stride, convinced the rain would pass. Instead, it grew heavier by the second, until sheets of water poured from the awnings overhead and drummed against the pavement in a relentless rhythm. Within moments, his hair was plastered to his forehead, and the damp had reached through every layer of his clothing. He told himself it didn't matter. He had appointments waiting, calls scheduled down to the minute, and a reputation for never being late or flustered by anything. Yet as he reached the next intersection, something made him slow. The street was nearly deserted except for a few people huddled under umbrellas. Car headlights glimmered in the rain, turning the puddles into a mosaic of white reflections. He was soaked through, and there was no practical reason to stop, but he did. He stepped under the narrow overhang of an old stone building and leaned against the wall. Rain sluiced down from the roof in steady rivulets, splashing across his polished shoes and pooling around the edges of the sidewalk. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the damp fabric clinging to his skin, and tried to remember the last time he'd been caught unprepared like this. He couldn't. In a way he couldn't quite name, it was almost a relief to be reminded he wasn't as insulated as he liked to pretend. Minutes slipped by, and he felt the chill beginning to settle deeper into his bones. He could have called for a car, but he didn't. He stayed there, watching the rain. There was something oddly hypnotic in the way it blurred the lines of the city, softening the hard edges and washing the grime from the sidewalks. He thought, not for the first time lately, how empty his days had become, how little any of it mattered when the conference calls were over and he was left alone in his silent penthouse. He was so lost in that thought that he almost didn't hear the footsteps approaching. They were small and hesitant, splashing lightly through the puddles, drawing closer until he felt a presence beside him. He turned his head, expecting to see a late commuter or a street vendor. But it wasn't an adult at all. It was a child. She couldn't have been more than 5. Her brown hair was plastered to her temples in damp curls, and her blue eyes were wide in a face that looked both exhausted and unafraid. She wore a bright yellow raincoat that hung almost to her ankles and blue jeans that were soaked dark to the knees. In her hands, she held a red umbrella with one of its metal ribs poking through the fabric, the canvas sagging under the weight of the rain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He realized he must look strange to her, this tall, dripping man in an expensive coat, standing in the cold as if he'd forgotten how to move. She blinked up at him, her small hands tightening on the umbrella's handle. Rain spattered between them, a curtain of water that felt like a barrier he didn't know how to cross. He opened his mouth to ask where her parents were, whether she was lost, but she spoke first in a voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear her. "Take it," she said, lifting the umbrella toward him with both hands. "Mama doesn't need it anymore." Her words landed with a weight he couldn't have anticipated. They settled in his chest, heavier than any of the rain soaking his skin. For a second, all he could do was stare at her, at the serious tilt of her small chin and the way she didn't flinch even when thunder cracked in the distance. He saw her trembling, not from fear but from cold, and he knew that no matter how many contracts he had signed, no matter how many millions he controlled, nothing he had ever done had prepared him for this moment. His fingers closed around the damp plastic handle of the umbrella, and he realized with a start that his hand was shaking. In that instant, the rain and the city and everything he thought he knew about his life seemed to recede into the background, leaving only her and the impossible truth of her simple offering. He didn't take the umbrella from her right away. For a moment he simply stood there, stunned by the quiet conviction in her voice, by the unshakable calm of a child offering something precious without asking for anything in return. The rain fell so heavily now that it splashed onto the toes of her little sneakers, soaking into the thin canvas and making her shiver from the cold. Edward felt an urge so fierce it startled him, to pull her into his arms, to wrap her in his coat and shield her from the downpour that had already soaked her through. He looked into her wide blue eyes, searching for any sign of fear, any hesitation. Instead, she regarded him with a solemn steadiness that seemed older than her years. Her hands didn't waver where they held the umbrella out to him. He could see how tightly she gripped the handle, the small knuckles whitened with effort as if she needed it to anchor herself in a world that had gone too quiet around her. Finally, he reached out and took hold of the umbrella, curling his fingers around the wet plastic handle with a care that felt almost ceremonial. The moment his skin touched it, she let go, her arms falling back to her sides with an exhausted finality. For the first time, he noticed how hollow her cheeks looked, how dark the shadows under her eyes had become. This was not a child who had been lost for an hour or two. This was a child who had been alone for far longer. He swallowed, feeling the ache of something unnameable pressing against his ribs. He wanted to ask her why she was out here by herself, why no one had come for her. But instead, what came out was something smaller, simpler, the only thing he could manage without his voice breaking. "Why doesn't your mama need it anymore?" he asked, keeping his tone as gentle as he could. She lifted her chin just enough to look him in the eye. When she spoke, her voice was as soft as before, but there was no uncertainty in it. "Because she died," she said, and though her lips quivered on the last word, she didn't look away. She got sick, and then she didn't wake up." His breath caught. He had read about these stories in the news, children left behind with no one to care for them, but they had always felt like tragedies that happened to other people, far from the circles in which he moved. It was different to hear it in her small voice, to see the raw edges of grief that she was too young to name. He struggled to find words, but nothing felt right. What comfort could he offer her? He was a stranger. A man she had found standing alone, dripping in his expensive coat, as lost in his own way as she was. "What's your name?" he asked after a moment, desperate to keep her talking, to give her something to focus on other than the cold and the sorrow. "Emma," she whispered, hugging her thin arms around herself. Her chin lowered again, and she looked down at the puddles gathering around her shoes as though she was ashamed to have spoken at all. "Emma," he repeated, testing the sound of it in his mouth. The syllables felt small and important, like a promise he hadn't yet made but already knew he couldn't break. "Emma," he said again, and this time her eyes lifted just slightly, as if she needed to be sure he really saw her. He shifted the broken umbrella into one hand and shrugged out of his coat. It was already soaked, but it was better than nothing. He crouched to drape it around her narrow shoulders, surprised by how small she seemed when he was this close. She didn't pull away. She didn't move at all, except to wrap her fingers in the folds of the wet fabric and pull it tighter around her. When he stood again, he realized he was shaking in earnest now, though it wasn't from the rain. It was the knowledge settling over him, heavy and undeniable, that if he walked away, if he left her here, she would simply stay standing in the downpour with nowhere else to go. He cleared his throat, searching for some sensible next step, but nothing about this was sensible. All he could see was the way she held onto his coat like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe," he said, and though his voice cracked, he didn't look away from her. "Somewhere warm." She didn't answer, but her small head dipped in the barest nod. He didn't know if she understood what he meant or if she simply had no more strength left to argue. He reached down, hesitating only a moment before lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Her damp hair smelled faintly of shampoo and rain, and she didn't protest or flinch when he held her against his chest. Instead, she let her head rest on his shoulder, the crown of it fitting beneath his jaw as if it had always belonged there. He turned and stepped out into the rain again, the broken red umbrella dangling uselessly from his fingers. He knew without question that his life, in all its orderly isolation, would never be the same after this moment. Edward moved quickly down the sidewalk, the rain blurring the edges of the world into a smear of gray and white. Every step felt heavier than the last, not because of Emma's slight weight in his arms, she was so small it was as if he carried nothing at all, but because of the quiet way she had given herself over to being carried. She didn't cling to him or hide her face. She simply rested her cheek against his soaked shirt as though she had no more energy left to be afraid. He could feel her shivering through the layers of his damp clothes, each tiny tremor a reminder of how close she had come to being lost out here in the cold. He kept his eyes forward, focusing on the glow of a cafe sign a block ahead. The place was usually crowded in the mornings, full of professionals grabbing coffee before work, but at this hour, with the rain falling in sheets, he hoped it might be quieter. When he reached the door, he shifted her weight higher against his chest and pulled it open, bracing himself for the inevitable stares. The warm air rushed over them, scented with coffee and fresh bread, and he felt Emma tense just slightly as the sudden change in temperature prickled her damp skin. The woman behind the counter looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of them. Edward realized then how they must appear, a man in a drenched shirt and tailored trousers, hair plastered to his forehead, carrying a little girl wrapped in a coat several sizes too big for her. For a second, he almost expected her to demand an explanation, but when she spoke, her voice was calm and matter-of-fact. "Take any table you like," she said gently. "I'll bring a towel and something warm." He nodded, too grateful to trust himself to speak, and carried Emma to a small booth near the back. He settled her on the cushioned bench and knelt to help her out of the wet coat, setting it carefully over the back of a chair to drip onto the tile floor. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere just past his shoulder. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him, whether he was just another stranger who would disappear, or whether she dared hope he might not. The barista returned with a towel and a paper cup of hot chocolate topped with a swirl of cream. She handed the towel to Edward, and he thanked her with a voice that felt rough in his throat. As soon as they were alone again, he unfolded the towel and began gently blotting Emma's hair. She didn't resist, only lowered her head and let him work, her breathing slow and uneven. When he finished, he pressed the cup of hot chocolate into her hands, wrapping his own around hers for a moment to steady them. "It's warm," he told her, trying to smile. "Just take a little sip." She looked up at him for the first time since he'd set her down, her blue eyes wary but no longer quite so empty. With the tiniest nod, she lifted the cup to her mouth and took a cautious taste. Her lips trembled, and for a moment he thought she might cry, but she only swallowed and set the cup carefully on the table. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it over the rain pounding the windows. "You don't have to thank me," he said, though he felt something in his chest loosen at the sound of her voice. "I'm just glad you're safe." She didn't answer, and he didn't press her to. Instead, he sank into the seat across from her and tried to collect his thoughts. The reality of what he had just done was beginning to sink in. He had left behind the safety of his routines, the anonymity of his structured life, and stepped into a responsibility he didn't understand but already knew he couldn't walk away from. He looked at Emma again, at the way she held her hands cupped around the warm paper cup as though it were the most precious thing she owned. Her hair had begun to curl as it dried, soft brown waves that framed her thin face. He could see now that she was exhausted, her eyelids drooping despite the way she fought to keep them open. "Emma," he said, choosing his words carefully, "do you have anyone you trust? Someone I can call for you?" Her eyes flickered, and for a moment he thought she might speak. But she only shook her head, a slow, resigned motion that made her look older than any child should. "No one," she whispered. He felt the truth of it like a cold wind inside his chest. He could see it in her posture, in the way she didn't even look around to see who might be watching. She had stopped expecting anyone to come for her. And in that moment, Edward knew with absolute clarity that he had already made his decision. He wasn't going to leave her here to wait for a future she was too young to survive alone. He didn't know how he would do it or what it would cost, but it didn't matter anymore. He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, feeling how small and cold her fingers were beneath his palm. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "Not anymore." And as she looked up at him, her eyes huge and uncertain, he felt the last of his old life recede like the rain outside the window. The cafe grew quieter as the rain outside continued to fall, a steady, muffled roar against the windows. Edward watched Emma sip her hot chocolate in small, cautious mouthfuls, her thin shoulders rising and falling as she breathed. Every so often she would glance up at him as if to check that he was still there, then drop her gaze again quickly, as though afraid she was somehow doing something wrong just by looking. He wished he could think of something reassuring to say, something that would make all of this easier, but no word seemed big enough to close the gulf of loss between them. While she drank, he pulled his phone from his pocket and turned it over in his hands. He knew he needed to call someone, social services, the police, maybe even a lawyer. Part of him wanted to believe that was the responsible thing to do, the only thing that made sense. But as he looked at Emma, at the way her small fingers gripped the paper cup like it was her last defense against the cold, he realized he couldn't bear to hand her off to strangers, to watch her disappear into a system that would file her away under a case number and call that safety. He set the phone down and rested his elbows on the table, studying the streaks of water on the floor from where his coat still dripped. In all his years of building companies and amassing wealth, he had never once imagined himself responsible for a child. He had always believed he was too selfish, too absorbed in his own ambitions. And yet here he was, unable to look away from the quiet, steady presence of this little girl who had already lost more than most people could understand. A memory surfaced without warning, something he hadn't thought of in decades, himself at not much older than Emma, standing in a dim hospital hallway while a nurse explained that his mother would not be coming home. He had felt then exactly as Emma looked now, small and numb and alone in a world that had abruptly become too large. He remembered how no one had knelt down to look him in the eye, no one had told him that it wasn't his fault, no one had offered to stay. That memory, raw and uninvited, settled like a stone in his chest. He leaned forward, lowering his voice so it would feel like a confidence rather than an interrogation. "Emma," he said, and waited until she lifted her eyes to his, "Do you know where your father is?" Her expression changed. Something in her face tightened and closed off. She stared at the table, her hands going still. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice so soft it was nearly swallowed by the sounds of the cafe, she spoke. "He doesn't want me," she whispered. "He left when I was a baby. Mama said he only came back when she got sick. He wanted money. He said if she gave him money, he would sign the papers to say I wasn't his anymore." Edward felt his heart clench with a cold, furious grief that was as much for his own past as it was for hers. He tried to keep his face calm, but his hands tightened into fists where she couldn't see them. How could anyone look at this child, so brave, so heartbreakingly small, and see her as a burden to be sold off for a price? He had met ruthless men in boardrooms, had watched them dismantle livelihoods without blinking, but this was something different, something uglier. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to let go of the anger. Did he ever come back after that? Emma shook her head without looking up. "No," she said. "Just Mama and me." The simplicity of it, the quiet acceptance in her voice, broke something in him he hadn't known was still intact. He realized then that he had been thinking in terms of temporary solutions, keeping her warm, keeping her fed, finding someone better equipped to take her in. But the idea of sending her away now felt as impossible as stepping out into the rain and leaving her behind. He reached across the table again, covering her small hand with his. She flinched at first, then stilled, her gaze fixed on the place where their skin touched. He knew he was making promises he didn't fully understand, promises that would change the course of his life in ways he could not predict. But he also knew he could not turn his back on her. "Emma," he said softly, I don't know everything yet, but I want you to know something. He waited until her eyes lifted to his again, wide and shining with questions he didn't know how to answer. You don't have to be afraid that no one will stay. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then her lower lip began to tremble, and she set the cup down carefully so she wouldn't spill it. One fat tear slid down her cheek, and then another, until she was crying without making a sound. He didn't think, he just stood, stepped around the table, and sat beside her on the bench. She turned without hesitation and pressed her face into his chest, her small body racked with silent sobs. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the damp heat of her tears soak through his shirt, and closed his eyes. All he could do was hold her and hope that in some small way, she could feel the truth in what he had said. That even if he didn't yet know how to be what she needed, he would not be the man who walked away. When Emma finally cried herself into an exhausted stillness, she stayed pressed against Edward's side as though afraid that if she let go, he might vanish like all the others. Her hair was damp against his shirt, her breathing ragged but steadying as the storm of her tears began to subside. He didn't try to move her or tell her it was time to stop. He simply kept one arm around her shoulders, his palm resting gently on her small back, and tried to pour all the steadiness he could muster into that simple touch. As he sat there, he became aware that the rain outside had eased, though water still tapped intermittently at the windows. The world beyond the glass looked softer somehow, as though even the city itself were pausing to catch its breath. Eventually, she shifted just enough to look up at him. Her face was blotchy and red from crying, but there was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before, something tentative and searching, as if she were trying to decide whether it was safe to trust him. He met her gaze without looking away, letting her see whatever was in his own expression: fatigue, resolve, the quiet certainty that no matter how complicated this became, he would not abandon her to face it alone. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice rough from the hours of strain and the rawness of everything she had shared. She nodded without speaking. It struck him how easily she answered now, how she no longer seemed to fear that any question might be a trap. That small shift felt as significant as any of the decisions he had made that day. He stood and offered her his hand, and she took it with surprising confidence, slipping her fingers into his without hesitation. Together they walked to the counter, where the same barista was wiping down the espresso machine. When she looked up and saw them, she offered a kind, knowing smile. Without needing to ask, she began preparing a sandwich and another hot chocolate. Edward pulled out his wallet and paid before she could hand him a receipt, murmuring his thanks in a voice that felt too thin for everything he wanted to convey. They carried the tray back to their table, and Emma climbed onto the bench again, her hands still trembling slightly as she unwrapped the sandwich. She ate slowly, each bite deliberate, and he realized she was probably trying to make it last as long as she could. Watching her, he felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with a kind of fierce protectiveness he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. While she finished her meal, he pulled his phone out again, but this time he didn't waver. He called the only person he trusted implicitly in matters that went beyond contracts and numbers, his attorney and longtime friend, Henry Whitaker. The moment Henry answered, his warm, unflappable voice came through the line, and for the first time all day, Edward felt the tension in his shoulders ease by a fraction. He stepped a little away from the table to keep his voice low, though Emma's eyes followed him wherever he moved. He explained everything in calm, measured sentences: where he'd found her, what she had told him, what she didn't have: no relatives, no resources, no one to claim her. He said it all without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. When he finished, there was a long pause. "You realize this isn't something you can just fix overnight," Henry said eventually, his tone gentle but edged with the seriousness Edward had expected. "If you take her in, even temporarily, you're making a commitment that will follow you the rest of your life." "I know," Edward said quietly, and was surprised by how certain he felt. "But she has no one. I can't walk away from that." There was another brief silence, and then Henry sighed in that resigned way he always did when Edward had already decided something. "All right. I'll start the paperwork to establish emergency guardianship. You'll need to bring her somewhere safe for the night. I'll come by first thing in the morning." "Thank you," Edward said, meaning it more deeply than he could say. He hung up and returned to the table. Emma looked up at him, her expression wary again, and he realized she was waiting to hear if he was about to tell her she had to leave. He sank onto the bench beside her and folded his hands on the table, wanting to be sure she understood. "Emma," he said gently, "I called someone who's going to help us. It means you don't have to go anywhere tonight. You'll come home with me, and tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps together." Her brow furrowed, as though she was trying to process the idea that she wouldn't be alone. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. And in that single word, in the quiet way she accepted his promise, he felt something shift in both of them. It wasn't quite trust yet, but it was the beginning of something that felt just as important: hope. He helped her into her coat, which was still damp but no longer dripping, and took the broken red umbrella she had left leaning against the bench. As they stepped back out into the street, the air smelled clean and new, the rain having scrubbed the city of all its usual grime. Emma slipped her hand into his again, and he closed his fingers around hers without hesitation. He knew he was stepping into a life he hadn't planned for, one that would demand more of him than any boardroom ever had. But as they began walking toward the car, her small steps matching his, he also knew that nothing had ever felt more necessary or more right. The ride back to Edward's house was silent, but it was not the same tense, uncertain silence that had filled the cafe earlier. Emma sat in the back seat, wrapped in his spare wool coat, the collar turned up almost to her ears. Her damp hair was tucked behind her shoulders, and she kept her gaze fixed on the rain-slicked world passing beyond the window. He checked the mirror every few minutes, more out of a need to reassure himself that she was really there than because he thought she might try to run. She did not look afraid, only bone-tired, as though the last of her energy had been spent the moment she'd allowed herself to cry. The further they drove, the more Edward found himself thinking about the strange shape this day had taken. He had woken that morning expecting nothing more than another routine of meetings and carefully orchestrated transactions. Now, only hours later, he was bringing a child into his home. A child who had no reason to believe any adult would ever stay. The thought of it struck him with a pang he didn't know how to name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even guilt, though he felt plenty of that for all the comforts he had taken for granted while children like her had gone unnoticed in the shadows of the city. It was something simpler and harder to shake, a quiet conviction that he could not let her down. When they reached the house, he pulled the car into the garage, shielding them from the last thin drizzle that fell across the driveway. He switched off the engine and sat for a moment, breathing into the hush that settled around them. Emma turned her head to look at him through the gap between the seats, her eyes wide and solemn. She did not ask where they were or whether she was really allowed to be there. She only waited, her small hands folded in her lap, as if she had learned that all she could do was wait for someone else to decide her fate. He got out and came around to open her door. As she climbed down, she looked up at the tall garage ceiling, her gaze flickering over the gleaming car parked beside them and the neat rows of shelves stacked with supplies. He saw her take in every detail with that same alert wariness, like someone collecting evidence to prepare for whatever came next. Inside, the house was hushed and almost oppressively clean. He had always liked it that way, orderly, predictable, free of any reminder of how empty it really was. But as he watched Emma step carefully over the threshold, her small sneakers leaving damp marks on the tile, he felt a strange shame at how sterile it must look to a child. He closed the door behind them and set his keys quietly in the bowl on the side table. "Would you like to see your room?" he asked, his voice softer than he meant it to be. Emma glanced up at him, searching his face as though trying to detect a hidden condition behind the offer. Then she gave a small nod. He led her up the sweeping staircase, the quiet echo of their footsteps the only sound in the vast space. The guest room was not much more than a blank canvas, a soft bed dressed in clean linens, a small dresser, an armchair in the corner. When he had called ahead, the housekeeper had tried to add what she thought a child might need, a folded quilt in pale colors, a little lamp shaped like a moon. It was not much, but it was something. He held his breath as Emma stepped inside. She looked around, her eyes lingering on the quilt, the lamp, the window that overlooked the garden. He half expected her to shrink back, to say she couldn't stay, but she did neither. She walked to the edge of the bed and set her hand on the blanket, pressing her palm against it as though testing whether it was real. "This is for me?" she asked, her voice small and incredulous. "Yes," he said, and though the word was simple, it felt heavier than any commitment he had ever spoken. "It's yours." Her shoulders loosened just a little, and he realized she had been bracing herself to be told she had misunderstood. That there was no place here for her after all. He moved to the closet and opened the door, showing her the empty shelves and hangers. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll get you some clothes and anything else you need." She nodded without looking at him, her gaze fixed on the corner where the little moon lamp sat. "I'm going to be right down the hall," he added quietly. "If you need anything at all, you can come find me." This time, she turned to meet his eyes. For a moment, he thought she might say something more, but she only pressed her lips together and nodded again. "I'll leave the door open," he said, though he was sure she hadn't asked. She climbed carefully onto the bed, pulling her legs up beneath her, and leaned back against the pillow. He thought she might resist sleep, that she would lie awake listening for footsteps, but her eyelids were already drooping as though she could no longer keep them open. Edward stepped out into the hallway, leaving the door ajar as promised. He stood there for a moment, looking back at the small shape curled on the bed, and felt a hollow ache in his chest that was something very close to love. He had not chosen this. He had not planned for it. But as he turned and walked down the hall to his own room, he realized he was grateful for the first time in years that something had finally broken through the fortress of his solitude. In that quiet space between two closed doors, he understood that whatever happened next, he would never again be able to pretend he was alone in the world. Edward barely slept that night. He lay in the dark, fully dressed atop the covers, the glow of the hallway light spilling through the crack beneath his door. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's small face staring up at him in the rain, her voice repeating those words over and over, "Mama doesn't need it anymore." He had never known how much a sentence could haunt him. The hours crawled by, each minute thick with thoughts he couldn't quiet. He tried to reassure himself that he had done the right thing by bringing her here, that he wasn't just acting on some selfish need to fill the silence of his life with a purpose he had never earned. But no matter how many times he told himself this was about her, about keeping her safe, a part of him still wondered if he deserved the chance to be anything more than a stranger offering temporary shelter. Sometime after midnight, he got up and paced the length of the hallway, pausing outside her door to listen for any sound of distress. All he heard was the steady rhythm of her breathing. That quiet steadiness soothed him more than he expected, and he returned to his room, though sleep continued to elude him. As the first light of dawn began to gather along the horizon, he finally sat in the chair by the window, watching the sky pale from charcoal to dove gray. At 7 o'clock sharp, his phone buzzed with a message from Henry. It was short and to the point, "I'll be there in an hour." "You did the right thing." Edward let the phone rest on his knee for a long time before he answered, the words clumsy under his thumbs, "Thank you. I hope she believes that too." He set the device aside and rubbed a hand over his face. He could face mergers worth hundreds of millions without blinking, but the thought of that small girl waking up afraid in his house made him feel unsteady in a way he had never known. When he heard soft footsteps in the hall, he stood quickly and stepped into the doorway. Emma was hovering at the top of the stairs, wearing the same jeans and a borrowed t-shirt that fell nearly to her knees. Her hair was tangled and her eyes still swollen from crying, but she looked more alert this morning, more like a child who hadn't given up entirely. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then she shifted her weight and looked down at the floor. I didn't know if I was allowed to come out, she said, her voice husky with sleep. You never have to ask permission to leave your room, he said gently, feeling something in his chest tighten at the fact that she thought she needed to. You can go anywhere you like. She nodded, her small hands twisting together, and he beckoned her to follow him downstairs. The kitchen was bright with the early light, and he gestured toward the table already set with toast, cut fruit, and scrambled eggs. She paused on the threshold, studying the food with the same wary caution she had shown everything else. It's for you, he said, and tried to smile in a way that wasn't too expectant. All of it. Emma took a step forward, then another, until she was close enough to pull out a chair. She climbed into it carefully, glancing at him once before she picked up a piece of toast and took a tentative bite. He busied himself with pouring coffee and refilling her glass of juice, anything to keep from staring at her too intently. But when he looked over, he saw that her shoulders had relaxed a little, the simple fact of a meal and a place to sit easing something in her he hadn't realized was still coiled tight. They ate in companionable silence until the doorbell rang. Emma jumped, her eyes widening with alarm, but he lifted a calming hand. It's all right. That's the friend I told you about, Henry. She didn't say anything, but she set the toast down carefully and watched him cross the foyer. He opened the door to find Henry standing there in his impeccable suit, holding a leather briefcase that looked almost comically formal given the circumstances. Henry's gaze flicked over Edward's face, then passed him to the glimpse of Emma in the kitchen. You look like you haven't slept, Henry said, his voice low as he stepped inside. I haven't, Edward admitted. Come on. I'll introduce you. Emma sat very still as they entered, her hands folded neatly on the table. Her gaze went from Henry to Edward, searching for any sign that this was another change she would have to brace for. Emma, Edward said, sinking to a knee beside her chair so he could look her in the eye. This is Henry. He's a lawyer, but he's also my friend. He's going to help us figure out what to do next. Her eyes flickered to Henry, then back to Edward. Am I going to have to leave? She asked, her voice so small it nearly broke him. No, Edward said immediately, and he felt the force of his conviction as if it were something solid anchoring them both. Not unless you want to. No one is going to take you away without asking you first. Henry cleared his throat, his professional reserve wavering just a little. He's telling the truth, Emma. We're here to help you stay safe, not to make you go anywhere you don't want to go. For a long moment, she looked between them, her expression guarded. Then she nodded once, the tiniest motion, but it felt like a beginning. Edward rose and rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. He could feel how tense she still was, but there was no flinch under his touch, only the fragile weight of her trust beginning to form. As Henry set down his briefcase and began spreading out papers on the table, Edward knew that the day ahead would be full of questions and signatures and explanations he could never have anticipated. But standing there with Emma beside him, he felt steadier than he had any right to. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning unfolded in a quiet, deliberate rhythm that seemed to soothe Emma in ways Edward hadn't dared to hope for. Henry worked methodically through a stack of documents, explaining each form in language simple enough for a child to follow if she was listening, though she said almost nothing. Edward watched her from his place beside the kitchen table, studying the way she kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes trained on the cup of juice in front of her, as if she were afraid to look up and find that this fragile sense of safety had been an illusion all along. Every time Henry paused to ask for a signature or a nod of understanding, Edward was careful to lay a reassuring hand on her shoulder or let his voice stay calm and measured, never pressing her for more than she was able to give. As the hours passed, the reality of what they were doing settled deeper into Edward's bones. This was no longer a temporary gesture, no longer just a kindness offered on a rainy day. Every page he signed, every legal affirmation Henry placed before him, bound him further to a promise he had spoken aloud in the cafe and carried in his heart ever since: you're not alone. Not anymore. He didn't think of the questions that would come later, what his colleagues would say, what the media might dig up if anyone learned the truth of Emma's situation, what it might cost his reputation to upend his life for a child who was not his by any conventional right. In that kitchen, all he could think about was how small she looked sitting in that big chair and how much he wanted her to believe she was finally safe. When the paperwork was done, Henry gathered the pages into his briefcase and straightened, his gaze moving between Edward and Emma with something like quiet respect. He hadn't said much beyond the necessities, but there was an understanding between them that did not require more words. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back. "I'll file everything today," he said. "Emergency guardianship is in place. No one can remove her without a court order, and I'll make sure that doesn't happen." Edward nodded, unable to summon any eloquence, and only managed, "Thank you," in a voice that was rough with all the things he didn't know how to say. After Henry left, the house fell into a hush so complete that it magnified every small sound, the faint tick of the kitchen clock, the creak of the floor when Emma shifted in her seat. She still hadn't moved from the table, her hands worrying the hem of the too big t-shirt she wore. Edward thought of how many mornings she must have spent waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to be withdrawn, for the door to open on another goodbye. He couldn't erase the past she carried inside her, but he could at least give her this day without more fear. "Would you like to go outside?" he asked, trying to keep his tone as casual as if he were offering any child a chance to play. "It's finally stopped raining." She looked up, her lashes still damp from earlier tears, and her mouth formed a hesitant question. "Outside, here?" "Here," he said, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "There's a garden. I thought you might like to see it." He waited while she slid carefully off the chair and crossed to his side. She didn't take his hand, but she stood close enough that he could feel her presence like a fragile thread of connection between them. He opened the back door and let the morning breeze drift in. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the sweetness of damp grass and the faint mineral scent left behind by rain. They stepped out together, her small bare feet tentative on the flagstone path. He watched as she paused to touch the leaves along the edge, her fingers brushing over droplets of water still clinging to the stems. She didn't say anything, but she walked further into the garden without waiting to see if he would follow. He kept a careful distance, not wanting to crowd her. In the center of the yard, a single rosebush had survived the winter better than the rest of the landscaping. Its pale blossoms were bowed under the weight of rainwater, but still intact. Emma crouched in front of it and reached to cup one bloom in her hand, her thumb lightly stroking the velvety petal. Edward thought of all the times he had walked past that rosebush without even noticing it, too consumed with his own plans to care whether it lived or died. Seeing it through her eyes, it seemed almost miraculous that anything so delicate had endured. She turned her head enough to look back at him, her blue eyes brighter than he'd seen them yet. "It's pretty," she said, her voice so soft it blended with the breeze. "It is," he agreed, and for a moment, he could almost imagine that this was simply a morning like any other, a father and daughter discovering something lovely in their own backyard. He walked to her slowly and crouched beside her so their faces were level. "Emma," he said, feeling the words gather weight as he spoke them, "I know this has all been very fast. I know you don't have any reason to believe that you can trust me yet. But I want you to know something." She turned fully to face him, her expression open in a way that made his heart ache. "No matter what happens," he said, and he laid a hand gently over hers where it rested against the rose, "I'm not going to leave you. You don't ever have to wonder about that again." Her lower lip quivered, and for an instant he thought she might start to cry. Instead, she did something far braver, she let go of the flower and reached for his hand. Her small fingers closed around his as though she were testing whether he would pull away. When he didn't, when he only folded his larger hand around hers, she let out a long, shaky breath. And in that moment, as they knelt together in the quiet garden with the rain-washed petals brushing against their skin, Edward felt the last of his old certainties fall away. He didn't know what their future would look like or whether he was worthy of the trust she was offering him. But he knew with absolute clarity that he would spend every day proving to her that he meant what he'd said. He would never leave her. Not today. Not ever.